The Unspoken Truth, Chapter 1. The Dying Whisper. Maine, 2024. Laura Ashton, 50 years old, stood at the precipice of a life she believed was perfectly understood. An accomplished architect, her days in the picturesque coastal town of Kennebunkport were a symphony of order. A loving husband, 2 thriving adult children, a home meticulously designed for comfort and beauty. She knew she was adopted, an infant taken in by the kind and devoted Ashtons, after her biological parents, she was told, perished in a tragic accident. Her childhood memories were sun-drenched and idyllic, punctuated only by a fleeting, unsettling image of fire and smoke that she always dismissed as a forgotten dream, a childhood nightmare. Her past was settled, a closed chapter, until Mrs. Edith Cutter. Edith, her eccentric, reclusive neighbor in her late 80s, was a former schoolteacher, a woman of sharp wit and even sharper observations, now confined to her bed, her life flickering like a dying candle. Laura, always kind, had taken it upon herself to sit with Edith in her final days, reading to her, listening to her rambling anecdotes, sharing quiet moments that felt both poignant and profoundly sad. Edith had no family, no close friends, and Laura felt a deep obligation to offer comfort in her final moments. She brought Edith's favorite herbal tea, adjusted her pillows, and listened patiently as the old woman drifted in and out of lucidity. The evening air was heavy with the scent of salt and impending change. Outside, the last rays of a late spring sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the neat lawn. Inside, the quiet hum of medical equipment provided a low, rhythmic counterpoint to the gentle ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hall. Edith, her breath shallow, her eyes cloudy with the haze of morphine and memory, stirred. She turned her head, her gaze fixing on Laura. Her grip, surprisingly strong for someone so frail, clutched Laura's hand. The sudden strength in her touch, the piercing clarity in her eyes, jolted Laura. "Laura," Edith rasped, her voice a thin whisper, barely audible above the rhythmic beep of the bedside monitor. Her gaze was piercing, filled with an urgency that sent a shiver down Laura's spine. "You're not who they say you are. They lied to you. The real Laura, she..." Edith's words dissolved into a ragged gasp, her grip slackened, and her eyes, still fixed on Laura's, glazed over. A final, shuddering breath, and then silence. The monitor flatlined, a long, mournful tone filling the room, an abrupt and terrifying end to a life, and to the last words of a dying woman. The nurse, who had been quietly attending, stepped forward, a sympathetic hand on Laura's arm. "She's gone, dear." But Laura heard nothing, saw nothing beyond the echo of those last chilling words. "You're not who they say you are. They lied to you. The real Laura, she." The perfectly constructed world of Laura Ashton shattered into a million pieces. Who were they? Her adoptive parents? The kind, loving people who had given her everything? Who was the real Laura? And what was the lie that had been woven into the very fabric of her existence? A deception so profound it could only be revealed on a deathbed. The idyllic past she had embraced, the unwavering belief in her own story, crumbled around her. The image of fire and smoke, long dismissed as a mere childhood nightmare, now flared to life in her mind, sharper, more terrifying, infused with a new, ominous significance. Edith's dying whisper wasn't just a revelation, it was an explosive charge. igniting a devastating firestorm in the placid landscape of Laura's life, threatening to consume everything she thought she knew, everything she believed herself to be. The quiet room, once filled with the peaceful passing of an old woman, was now a crucible of unsettling questions, demanding answers that Laura was not yet prepared to seek, let alone face. Chapter 2: The Cracks in the Canvas. Edith Cutter's dying words reverberated in Laura's mind, a relentless, haunting echo that drowned out the hum of the world. "You're not who they say you are. They lied to you. The real Laura." The silence that followed Edith's passing was deafening, filled only by the frantic beat of Laura's own heart, a drum against the sudden, terrifying void of her certainty. The perfect canvas of her life, once so clear and ordered, now showed profound, unsettling cracks, spiderwebbing outwards from the epicenter of Edith's final, cryptic message. The immediate aftermath of Edith's death was a blur of arrangements, condolences, and feigned composure. Laura went through the motions, a polite smile fixed on her face, while internally a storm raged. She couldn't shake the words. Edith wasn't prone to baseless accusations. She was eccentric, yes, but sharp, insightful, with a keen memory for local happenings and an almost uncanny ability to perceive hidden truths. Had she truly known something, or was it merely the rambling of a mind succumbing to the final stages of life? The logical, architectural part of Laura's brain grappled with the irrationality of it all, yet her gut, a primal instinct she trusted implicitly, screamed that Edith's words were a prophecy, a key. That night, alone in her meticulously designed home, the silence felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old books suddenly felt alien. Laura wandered through rooms that suddenly felt unfamiliar, her eyes scanning familiar objects as if seeing them for the first time, searching for a sign, a clue, a secret hidden in plain sight. She pulled out old photo albums, dusty repositories of her cherished past, bound in worn leather and filled with the tangible memories of a seemingly blissful childhood. Childhood images, snapshots of school plays, awkward teenage years, sun-drenched family vacations, joyful birthday parties. She held them, her fingers tracing the faces of her adoptive parents, her own younger self, trying to reconcile the smiling, carefree girl in the pictures with Edith's dying accusation. She studied her early childhood photos, from infancy up to age 5. Her adopted parents, always loving, always present, their smiles wide, their eyes filled with adoration for their little girl. But then, a subtle, unsettling discrepancy began to emerge. In photos from her very first few years, her hair seemed a shade lighter, almost flaxen, her eyes a slightly different shape, her nose a tad more upturned. It was barely perceptible, a fleeting impression, almost dismissible as the trick of light or the natural changes of a growing child. But once noticed, it was impossible to unsee. It was as if she was looking at two different children, subtly blending into one, the transition so seamless as to be almost imperceptible, yet now glaringly obvious under the harsh light of suspicion. The initial instinct to dismiss it as a trick of the mind quickly faded, replaced by a cold, unsettling dread. And then the smoke, the pervasive, acrid smell that sometimes invaded her dreams, clinging to the back of her throat. The flash of orange and red through a window, impossibly vivid, almost tangible. a child's cry, muffled and desperate, echoing from a place she couldn't quite grasp. A vague, primal fear that she had always dismissed as a product of an overactive imagination or a simple childhood nightmare. Now, it surged forward, a terrifying clarity demanding recognition. This wasn't a dream. This was a memory, a suppressed trauma, clawing its way to the surface. Her adoptive parents, bless their hearts, were nearing 80. They had given her everything: stability, profound love, unparalleled opportunities. They had always told her the same consistent story. Her biological parents died in a tragic house fire when she was an infant, and they had adopted her through a reputable agency, a process they described as smooth and blessed. They had painted a picture of seamless transition, of a child welcomed into a loving home, a life without shadows or unanswered questions. But Edith's words, they lied to you. The accusation hung heavy in the air, a poisonous vapor contaminating everything she had ever believed. Laura knew she couldn't confront her parents immediately. The truth, if it existed, would be devastating for them, particularly at their advanced age and delicate health. Their love for her was undeniable, a fierce and abiding force, and she couldn't risk shattering their remaining years with a truth that might destroy them. She needed more. She needed concrete evidence, something beyond a dying whisper and a fleeting facial resemblance in old photos, something undeniable that she could present. She decided to seek out her childhood friends, hoping for an external perspective, an objective memory from someone who had known her since those formative years. Matthew, her closest friend from elementary school, who had also been adopted and lived a few towns over, and Sarah, her best friend throughout high school. Perhaps they, having known her from an early age, might recall something, some oddity, some fleeting comment that Laura had overlooked or forgotten in the rosy glow of her carefully curated memories. The cracks in the canvas of her life were widening, threatening to expose a hidden, terrifying truth that lay beneath. A truth that promised to redefine her entire existence. Chapter 3, Echoes from the Playground. The need for answers consumed Laura, a relentless fire in her gut that eclipsed all else. The unsettling discrepancies in her earliest childhood photographs, coupled with the persistent, chilling memory of the fire, fueled her determination. She had to talk to someone who knew her from those very early years, someone who might have witnessed something, however small, that could shed light on Edith's dying declaration. The weight of potential deception, of a life lived under a false pretense, was suffocating. Her first call was to Matthew, her childhood confidant. Matthew, now a history professor at Boston University, had also been adopted and was one of the few people who truly understood the subtle complexities and unspoken questions that came with growing up knowing you weren't biological. Their bond had always been strong, rooted in shared experiences and a quiet, mutual understanding, but their adult lives had drifted apart, settling into the comfortable rhythm of occasional holiday cards and infrequent phone calls. This call, however, was different, urgent, primal. "Matthew, it's Laura," she began, her voice tight with suppressed anxiety, a tremor she hoped he wouldn't notice. She explained Edith's recent death, and then, with a carefully modulated tone, delivered her chilling last words. Then, cautiously, she brought up her own unsettling observations about her early photos and the recurring, terrifying memory of fire. She heard her own voice, dispassionate, almost clinical, as if describing someone else's nightmare. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched, pregnant with unspoken knowledge. Laura's heart pounded, a frantic drum against her ribs. She could almost hear Matthew thinking, sifting through old memories. "Laura, you're talking about the fire, aren't you?" Matthew's voice was quiet, almost hesitant, imbued with a strange pain memory. Melancholic resonance that sent a chill down Laura's spine. It wasn't a question of recognition. It was a statement of shared, painful memory. Laura's breath hitched. "You remember it too? Not just a dream?" The relief that flooded her was immense, quickly followed by a terrifying surge of certainty. "No, it wasn't a dream," Matthew confirmed, his voice now steadier, as if finally unburdening a long-held, unspoken secret. "It was real. A house fire just a few blocks from where we lived on Elm Street, if I remember correctly. The old abandoned house on Willow Creek Lane. It happened when we were very little, maybe 3 or 4. Everyone in town talked about it for weeks, hushed whispers and solemn nods. They said a young couple, sort of drifters, free spirits, lived there. And a child, a little girl, about our age." He paused, a palpable struggle in his voice, as if he were reaching into a dark, cobwebbed corner of his memory. "Laura, I remember my adoptive parents talking about it. Whispers. They said the real Laura Ashton, your parents' biological daughter, she died in that fire. It was a terrible accident. That's why your parents were so devastated. They had lost their only child." The words hit Laura like a physical blow, spilling the air from her lungs, leaving her gasping for breath. The real Laura Ashton, her parents' biological daughter, dead. In that fire. The revelation was brutal, undeniable. "What?" Laura whispered, barely able to form the word, her voice a raw rasp. "No, my parents. They told me my biological parents died in a fire. Not their daughter, not the real Laura." The protest was weak, a futile attempt to cling to the narrative that had defined her entire life. It was confusing, even back then, for everyone, Matthew continued, his voice now imbued with a strange, detached sorrow, as if recalling a historical event rather than a personal tragedy. "My parents were friends with yours, the Ashtons. I remember your parents were utterly devastated, beyond devastated. They were inconsolable. They had lost their child, their only child. And then, a few months later, you appeared. They said they adopted you quickly, through some private agency, and they named you Laura. Everyone thought it was a little strange, but they were so broken with grief, so consumed by sorrow, no one really questioned it. You looked similar enough, I guess. We were all just little kids, but I remember thinking, even then, that something was off. You weren't the same Laura, the quiet one, the one who always had a favorite teddy bear named Barnaby." He painted a vivid picture with his words. The ash-covered ruins, the lingering smell of smoke that permeated the entire neighborhood, the whispers of tragedy that hung heavy in the air, the collective sympathy for the Ashtons, and then the sudden, almost miraculous appearance of a new child, eerily similar in name and general appearance, quickly filling a gaping hole in their friends' lives. Matthew himself, as another adopted child, had been acutely aware of the undercurrents of the town's unspoken narrative. The hushed sympathy for the Ashtons, the quiet acceptance of their new daughter, a silent agreement to participate in the Ashtons' private grief, and their desperate attempt to mend their broken hearts. Laura's world spun, a dizzying carousel of shattered certainties. Her entire life, her very identity, was built on a foundation of profound grief and a desperate substitution. She wasn't just adopted, she was a replacement, a living memorial. The real Laura Ashton had perished, and she, a different child, had been given her name and her life, her very essence becoming intertwined with the ghost of another. The memory of the fire now solidified, no longer a nightmare, but a chilling eyewitness account. She saw the flames, felt the oppressive heat, heard the distant sirens wailing, tasted the acrid smoke in her mouth, and she knew, with terrifying certainty, that she had been there, not as the Ashton's child, but as someone else, a different child, with a different name, a different life that had been snatched away and replaced. The conversation with Matthew concluded, leaving Laura reeling, suspended in a void of disbelief and newfound dread. She needed to confront her adoptive parents. The truth, however painful, however devastating, had to come out. The echoes from the playground, distorted by time and childish perception, had finally found their voice, and they were screaming a truth that shattered everything Laura thought she knew about herself, demanding that she confront the fundamental lie at the core of her existence. Chapter 4. The Confession and the Promise. The conversation with Matthew had ripped away the protective veil from Laura's past, leaving her exposed to a devastating truth she had unknowingly carried for half a century. She wasn't just adopted, she was a replacement, a living memorial to a child who had perished. The real Laura Ashton, her adoptive parents' biological daughter. The weight of that knowledge was immense, almost crushing. A physical burden that seemed to press down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She drove to her parents' home, a familiar drive she had made countless times, but which now felt alien and fraught with unspoken tension. The quaint, charming New England house, once a sanctuary of warmth and unconditional love, now seemed to hum with a decades-old secret, a silent accusation hanging in the air, thick and palpable. Her adoptive parents, bless them, were frail. Their movements slow, their memories sometimes hazy with the encroachment of age. Confronting them would be excruciating, a task made infinitely harder by the depth of her love for them and her reluctance to inflict pain on the very people who had given her a life. She found them in the sunroom, bathed in the soft afternoon light that filtered through the large bay windows. Her mother was meticulously knitting a baby blanket, her needles clicking a gentle rhythm. Her father engrossed in the daily newspaper, the rustle of pages the only sound. They looked up, their faces softening with love when they saw her, their smiles warm and welcoming. It was this love, unwavering and true, a constant in her life, that made her task even harder. How could she wound the people who had sacrificed so much for her, who had loved her so unconditionally? "Mom, Dad," Laura began, her voice hoarse, thick with a tremor she couldn't control. She sat opposite them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to steady herself. "We need to talk about my past, about the fire on Willow Creek Lane." Her mother's knitting needles stilled, the half-finished blanket slipping from her lap to the floor. Her father's newspaper slowly lowered, revealing a face suddenly etched with profound fear and an unbearable, decades-old sorrow. Their eyes met Laura's, and in them she saw not denial, but a deep, long-buried pain, a grief so profound it had etched itself into the very fabric of their beings. They knew. They had always known this day might come. Edith Cutter told me something before she died. Laura continued, pushing through the tremor in her voice, choosing her words carefully, yet directly. And Matthew remembered things. The real Laura, your daughter, she died in that fire, didn't she? Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. It hung in the air, thick and palpable, laden with the weight of unspoken years. Then her mother, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks, let out a choked sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. Her father, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn, reached for his wife's hand, clasping it tightly, offering a silent anchor in their shared storm of grief. "Oh, Laura, my sweet girl," her mother sobbed, her voice cracking with decades of unspoken grief, a raw, primal sound that tore at Laura's heart. We wanted to protect you. We wanted to protect ourselves. We were so broken." Her father, his voice a strained whisper, raw with the effort of revisiting such agony, began to recount the devastating story. Their daughter, Laura Marie Ashton, a vibrant, joyful 3-year-old, a ray of sunshine in their lives, had been visiting friends, a young couple with a child of their own, who lived in a small, rustic house on Willow Creek Lane, just a few blocks away. That house caught fire, a terrible accident, a faulty electrical wire in the old structure. The fire spread rapidly, engulfing the house in minutes. Their daughter, along with the other child and the young couple, were caught inside. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was a raging inferno, and it was too late. All presumed lost. "Our world ended that day," her father said, his voice raw with pain, his eyes distant, fixed on a horrific memory. "Laura was our only child, the light of our lives. We were utterly destroyed. There was no light left in our world," her mother continued, her voice gaining a desperate urgency, as if finally unleashing a torrent of long-held words. "We were a shell of ourselves." The house felt empty, hollow. We couldn't bear the silence, the crushing absence. We went through the motions of living, but inside we were dead. Then, a few months later, our adoption agency called. A baby girl, found wandering alone, just a few blocks from the site of the fire, miraculously unharmed, but with no identification. No parents, no name. She was roughly the same age as our Laura, and she looked so much like her. The same dark hair, the same little dimple when she smiled. It felt like a sign, a second chance, a miracle sent to us from above. They admitted they had adopted her quickly, bending some rules, fueled by a desperate, all-consuming need to fill the void, to soothe their unbearable grief. They gave her their daughter's name, Laura Ashton, hoping to reclaim a piece of what they had lost, to start anew, to bring light back into their shattered lives. They never told her the truth, not just to protect her from a past they believed was traumatic, but to protect their own fragile, healing hearts from the potential loss of her. They feared if she knew, she might leave them, or worse, resent them for the deception, for the very act that had brought her into their lives. "We loved you, Laura," her father pleaded, tears welling in his own eyes, mirroring hers. "We loved you from the moment we saw you. You were our daughter. You still are, always will be." Laura looked at their tear-streaked faces, saw the profound sorrow etched in their every line, the decades of burden finally unburdened. It wasn't malice, but overwhelming grief, love, and a desperate need for healing that had driven their actions. They had given her a life, a name, a home, a family out of a complex, tragic love, but love nonetheless. I know, Laura whispered, tears now streaming down her own face, a cleansing torrent. I know you loved me, and I love you, always. She reached out, taking their hands, a tangible connection to the love that had shaped her, regardless of the truth. But a new, even more profound mystery now opened before her. If she wasn't the Ashtons' biological daughter, and her biological parents weren't the ones who died in the Willow Creek fire, a fire she now knew she had witnessed, perhaps even escaped from, then who was she? Who were her real parents? And why had she been found wandering alone near that horrific scene, a lone survivor with no identity? The confession, while painful, came with a new promise, a new, deeper journey into her origins, to find the true story of the little girl who walked away from the flames, whose life had been rewritten, and whose identity had been hidden for half a century. The path ahead, though daunting, was now clear. Chapter 5, The Unseen Witness, the confession of her adoptive parents, while agonizingly painful, brought a strange, almost liberating sense of clarity. The scattered pieces of the puzzle, Edith's dying whisper, Matthew's fragmented memory, the subtle photographic discrepancies, and her own haunting, persistent fire dreams, clicked into place, forming a coherent, if devastating, narrative. She was not the Ashtons' biological daughter. The real Laura Ashton, a child beloved and lost, had tragically died. She was a different child, a nameless survivor, given a new name and a life out of love and unimaginable grief. But who was that other child? Who were her real parents? And why had she, as an infant, been found unharmed near the site of such a horrific fire, yet seemingly alone and utterly unidentifiable? The official story of her biological parents dying in the fire, the narrative that had shaped her entire life, was now utterly debunked. A logical, pragmatic architect in her demanded answers, precise and undeniable. Laura, now fueled by a desperate, primal need for her original truth, for the very foundations of her being, turned to Matthew. He was not just a friend. He was a historian, a meticulous researcher, and crucially, he had personal, childhood knowledge of the fire and the prevailing rumors. Together, they decided to delve into the official records of the Willow Creek Lane fire. No more whispers, no more half-remembered anecdotes, only facts. We need the police report, the fire department records, the coroner's report, anything that details the victims and the investigation, Matthew explained, his academic rigor kicking in. There must be an account of how you were found, if you weren't identified with the other victims, and the full identities of those who died, if they were truly identified. They started at the local historical society, a charming but dusty repository of Kennebunkport's past, then moved to the more formal archives at the town hall, and eventually the vast, labyrinthine county archives. It was a tedious, painstaking process, sifting through decades-old bureaucratic paperwork, microfilmed newspaper clippings, and faded official documents. The Willow Creek Lane fire of 1974, as they now confirmed, was indeed a notorious local tragedy, often remembered not just for its horror, but for its lingering air of mystery. They found the detailed police report, a thick file bound with yellowed tape. It listed the presumed victims as Ethan Cole and a woman identified only as Jane Doe, a young couple who had been renting the dilapidated property, known locally as transient free spirits or hippies. Their toddler, a girl, also presumed lost in the blaze. However, A small, almost overlooked detail in the margin of the report, a handwritten notation dated several days after the fire, caught Laura's eye. A sudden jolt of recognition. Child found wandering approximately a mile from fire site, appears unharmed, no identification, taken to local hospital, then placed in foster care. No immediate connection to fire victims established. Laura's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged gasp. That child was her. No immediate connection. Which meant the authorities never definitively identified her as belonging to Ethan Cole and Jane Doe. Why? Why the lack of a clear link? They needed to talk to someone who had been directly involved in the investigation. After several inquiries, they located Sergeant Reynolds, the retired police officer who had been one of the primary investigators on the Willow Creek fire. He was now in his early 80s, living quietly in a modest retirement community on the outskirts of town. His days spent tending a small rose garden and reminiscing with fellow retirees. He was initially hesitant to speak, his memories of the tragic event clearly still painful and deeply etched. "Ah, the Willow Creek fire," Sergeant Reynolds said, his voice raspy with age and the weight of distant memory. He gestured for them to sit. Terrible business. Cole, he was a young fella, full of ideals. An artist, some said. And the woman never did get a positive ID on her. They were off the grid, you might say. No family, no papers, no real trail before they rented that place. Just showed up one day, like so many others back then, living a different kind of life. No roots to trace. Laura carefully explained her story, her adoption, the name Laura Ashton, and the recent shattering discovery of the truth. She asked him directly about the child found near the site. Sergeant Reynolds' eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise and dawning comprehension. "You were that child? Well, I'll be. Always wondered what became of her. We never could definitively link you to Cole and the girl. No physical evidence, no witness to say you were theirs. No one even knew they had a child for sure. They were so private. Just vague rumors from neighbors. And you didn't have a scratch on you, not a single burn. It was odd." He frowned, leaning forward in his armchair, a look of deep thought on his face. But there was something else. A tip, anonymous. A call came in a few days after the fire, suggesting that Cole and the woman had been under surveillance. Not for the fire, mind you, but for their political activities. They were involved in some radical anti-war groups, a bit too vocal for the times. Some even said they were involved in some underground publishing, handing out pamphlets, encouraging draft dodging. It was the tail end of the 60s, you see, and things were heated. "Surveillance?" Laura repeated, a new layer of dread coiling in her stomach, a cold, tightening knot. The political landscape of the 1970s, the paranoia, the government crackdowns, it suddenly painted a chilling picture. Yes, the FBI was interested in them for their associations. The rumor was they might have faked their deaths, made it look like they died in the fire to escape detection, to disappear completely. It was just a rumor, mind you, but it stuck with me. We never found solid, undeniable human remains for them, just enough ash and bone fragments to satisfy the initial report and close the case, but not a full accounting. We suspected it was a staged scene, a desperate escape, but without proof and with no one else to pursue it, the case was closed as accidental. Too many other, more pressing crimes, you understand. And they were just drifters, after all. No one to miss them, officially. Laura and Matthew looked at each other stunned, the full weight of the truth finally settling upon them. faked their deaths. Her biological parents, they hadn't died in the fire. They had used it as a cover, a desperate, unimaginable act of self-preservation, leaving her behind in their flight. The unseen witness of her past was not a ghost or an accident, but a deliberate act of survival, a desperate gamble that had profoundly shaped her entire life, a sacrifice that had, in its own way, given her a chance at a different, safer existence. This revelation, while terrifying in its implications of abandonment and fear, finally explained everything. It was time to find out if they were still alive. It was time to find the people who had made such an impossible, heartbreaking choice. Chapter 6. The Ghosts of 74. The revelation that her biological parents likely faked their deaths in the Willow Creek fire, escaping persecution related to radical political activities of the late 1960s and early 1970s, shattered any remaining illusions Laura had about her past. The Jane Doe was her mother, and Ethan Cole her father. They hadn't died. They had vanished, leaving her behind in a desperate act of self-preservation. An impossible choice made under unimaginable pressure. The unspoken truth was not a tragedy of accidental death, but one of calculated deception born from extreme, terrifying circumstances. Laura felt a maelstrom of emotions, a searing anger at the abandonment, an overwhelming pity for the sheer desperation that must have driven such an agonizing choice, and a burning, primal need to find them. Were they still alive? Did they ever think of the daughter they left behind? Did they carry the same weight of unanswered questions, the same unaddressed grief? The thought was a relentless torment. Sergeant Reynolds, now fully invested in solving this decades-old mystery that had clearly bothered him for years, provided them with the old FBI case file numbers he vaguely remembered. He warned them that obtaining classified government documents from the 70s, especially those related to counterculture surveillance, would be incredibly difficult. A bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in Cold War-era secrecy. "You'll hit a lot of brick walls, Laura," he cautioned. "The government doesn't like to admit it was wrong, or that people just disappeared on their watch." Matthew, with his academic connections and a passion for historical research that bordered on obsession, took the lead on this formidable task. He navigated the labyrinthine world of Freedom of Information Act requests, contacting civil liberties organizations that championed transparency, and leveraging his vast network of historians who specialized in the turbulent Vietnam War era and its associated social movements. He made countless phone calls, wrote endless letters, and spent weeks sifting through microfiche in obscure university archives. The process was excruciatingly slow, frustrating, and often met with outright bureaucratic stonewalling. They received heavily redacted documents, vague denials, and long periods of absolute silence. But gradually, patiently, meticulously, fragments of information began to surface. Coded memos, heavily redacted surveillance reports, grainy black and white photographs of protests and gatherings where Ethan Cole and a woman identified only as subject 2 were visible, their faces obscured by shadows or the low quality of the film. They were indeed under intense FBI scrutiny. They were suspected of being involved in a clandestine anti-war publishing collective, printing and distributing pamphlets that criticized government policy, and possibly aiding draft dodgers, providing safe houses and false papers. Then a breakthrough, a declassified document buried deep within a forgotten archive box in a university library, mentioned a child, a fleeting, almost overlooked notation within a surveillance report. Subject two's infant, identified only as Jennifer, was present at the residence days prior to the incident. Disposition of child unknown post-fire. Jennifer. That name resonated with a strange, immediate familiarity for Laura. A name from some unremembered dream, perhaps, or a whisper from a time before she was Laura. It was the echo of her true self, a spark of recognition. The records further indicated that Ethan Cole and Subject 2 had indeed been officially presumed deceased in the fire, but with a highly unusual notation in the coroner's report. No full dental or fingerprint matches possible, circumstantial evidence only. It was a subtle, almost academic admission that the authorities themselves had harbored lingering doubts about the veracity of their deaths, yet had closed the case due to lack of further leads or resources. The most crucial piece of information came from an unexpected source, a former activist, an aging contact of Matthew's, who had known Ethan and Subject 2 personally in the tumultuous 70s. He was a wizened, weary man now, but his memory of those years was sharp and vivid. He remembered them, their fiery idealism, their unwavering commitment to their cause, and their growing fear of government reprisal. He confirmed the woman's name, Margaret Davies. She was a poet, a fierce intellectual, a passionate voice for justice, deeply committed to their shared movement. He remembered them having a baby girl, whom they affectionately called Jenna, short for Jennifer. He recounted a frantic, hushed meeting shortly before the fire, where Ethan and Margaret spoke of a desperate plan to disappear, to vanish completely, to protect themselves and their child from the growing threat of imprisonment and persecution. They believed their child would be safer with strangers in a conventional, anonymous life than with them constantly on the run, living underground. They loved that little girl, Jenna, more than anything, the activist said, his voice heavy with the weight of memory and unaddressed grief. It tore them apart, the idea of leaving her, but they truly believed they were protecting her from a life of fear, of being hunted, of never knowing peace. It was a heartbreaking choice, not an abandonment, a sacrifice. They would have died for their beliefs, but they chose to live, to fight another day, to protect their daughter's future. Armed with the names Ethan Cole and Margaret Davies and the profound knowledge of their desperate flight, Laura and Matthew expanded their search, now focusing on records outside the 1970s. Social security numbers, marriage licenses, property deeds, tax records, birth certificates, anything that might indicate a new identity, a life lived under different names, a deliberate erasure of their past selves. It was like searching for phantoms, for people who deliberately wished to remain unseen. Years of painstaking searching through public records, genealogical databases, and obscure online forums dedicated to missing persons and cold cases eventually led them to a quiet, rural community in upstate New York. A small organic farm nestled peacefully in a green valley, owned by a couple named Arthur and Mary Smith. The birth dates roughly aligned with what Ethan and Margaret's ages would be. The physical descriptions, based on old, blurry FBI photos and Matthew's friends' recollections, were tantalizingly similar, enough to ignite a powerful surge of hope and fear in Laura's heart. Laura's heart hammered. Arthur and Mary Smith. Could they be Ethan Cole and Margaret Davies? Her biological parents? The ghosts of 74, still alive, still carrying the immense burden of their past. and perhaps the agonizing memory of the child they left behind. The journey to find her true origins, a journey initiated by a dying whisper, was nearing its astonishing, life-altering climax, a confrontation with the most profound, deeply guarded secret of her life. The time for the unseen witness to finally speak was at hand. Chapter 7: The Reckoning. The journey to upstate New York was fraught with a mixture of terror and overwhelming anticipation, a nervous energy that vibrated in the air between Laura and Matthew. They drove in almost complete silence, the weight of their extraordinary discoveries pressing down on them, the implications of what they were about to do, almost too immense to comprehend. Arthur and Mary Smith, her biological parents, Ethan Cole and Margaret Davies. The names, the fragmented faces from old photographs, the chilling narratives of a life lived under deep cover, all now coalescing into a terrifying yet exhilarating reality. They found the farm, nestled peacefully in a verdant valley, a mosaic of rustic charm and quiet industry. An old, weather-beaten farmhouse, its paint faded by decades of sun and wind, stood proudly beside a large, faded red barn. Fields of carefully tended crops stretched out to a distant emerald forest. A classic, weathered pickup truck was parked near the house, a testament to a life lived close to the land. Laura's stomach churned, a knot of conflicting emotions. This was it, the moment of truth. They saw an older couple working in a meticulously kept vegetable garden. The woman, with her long graying hair pulled back in a neat braid, her face lined with age but still possessing a striking intensity in her eyes, looked strikingly like the young Margaret Davies in the old blurry FBI photos. The man, tall and lean, with the same strong jawline Laura remembered from Ethan Cole's images, moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his hands calloused from years of toil. Laura's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She couldn't just knock on the door, not after 50 years of silence, of a life built on a foundation of a profound, heartbreaking lie. How do you approach people who deliberately erased themselves, who sacrificed their daughter for survival? Matthew, sensing her profound hesitation, her visible trembling, stepped forward with a quiet determination. "I'll go first," he said gently, his voice a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "I'll say we're doing a historical project, tracing some old activists from the 70s. See how they react. Give them a chance to process before you reveal yourself." He approached the couple, offering a polite, almost academic greeting, a well-practiced calm masking his own anticipation. Laura watched from the car, her breath held tight in her chest, every nerve ending alert. She saw Margaret, Mary, turn, her head cocked slightly, her eyes meeting Matthew's. He spoke for a few minutes, his voice low, respectful, carefully explaining their supposed research. Then, he subtly, almost imperceptibly, gestured towards the car, a silent invitation for Laura to emerge. Laura saw Mary's eyes narrow slightly, then widen in a sudden, almost disbelieving recognition. Her hand flew to her mouth, a small gasp escaping her lips. She looked at Arthur, Ethan, her eyes filled with a dawning comprehension, then an overwhelming wave of raw, unadulterated emotion. The long-buried past was rising, undeniable. Laura opened the car door and stepped out. The click of the latch echoed in the sudden silence of the farm. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken history, with the weight of 50 years of separation. As she walked towards them, Each step felt like an eternity, a deliberate crossing of a threshold into a reality she had only just begun to comprehend. She saw the initial shock in her biological mother's eyes, then a flicker of deep recognition, followed by an overwhelming wave of raw, uncontained emotion. Her father's face, usually stoic, crumpled into an expression of disbelief and profound pain. "Jennifer?" Mary whispered. Her voice choked, barely a sound, yet it pierced Laura's heart with an immediate, undeniable familiarity. It was the name from the FBI file, her real name, the name she had heard only in whispers and fragmented dreams, now spoken aloud by the very woman who had given it to her. Laura nodded, tears streaming down her face, blurring her vision. "Yes, it's me, Jennifer." Her voice was a fragile whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of longing. Arthur, Ethan, dropped his gardening tools with a clatter. His face, usually strong and composed, crumpled in a way that ripped at Laura's soul. He stumbled forward, embracing Mary, burying his face in her shoulder, their bodies trembling together with decades of suppressed pain and longing, a silent explosion of grief and relief. The reunion was not a joyful, boisterous explosion of hugs and laughter, but a quiet, profound reckoning. They sat for hours on the porch, under the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves of an ancient oak tree, sharing their stories, finally bridging the chasm of 50 years. Ethan and Margaret recounted their life on the run, living under assumed identities, always looking over their shoulders, always wary of the past catching up. They had genuinely believed the fire had provided them the perfect cover, a way to disappear and protect their daughter from the dangers that surrounded them. It explained that they had deliberately left Jennifer, hoping she would be found and adopted into a stable, safe family, far from their volatile, hunted existence. It was the most agonizing decision of their lives, a choice born of desperate love and profound fear. "We watched from a distance for a while," Margaret confessed, her voice raspy with tears, her eyes still red-rimmed. "Saw you were taken to the hospital, then placed with a family, the Ashtons. We saw how much they loved you, how much they grieved. We thought it was better this way, safer. We never stopped thinking about you, our little Jenna. Every single day, every night." Laura, in turn, shared her story. Her loving adoptive parents, her confusion, the dying whisper of Edith Cutter, the painstaking journey to uncover the truth. She explained how she had been given the name Laura, the name of the Ashtons' lost daughter, and how her own son, James, had unknowingly carried the name of his biological uncle, Ethan's lost brother, or perhaps a beloved friend, a common name that had echoed through their hidden lives. "My son James died a few years ago," Laura said, her voice catching, raw with fresh grief. "His name, it just felt right. It chose him, and now I know why. He carried his uncle's name. He led me to you. His spirit somehow guided me back." Ethan and Margaret wept, their hearts breaking for the grandson they never knew, the echo of their own lost child, a pain that transcended time and separation. The circle of names, of lives, of grief and love was suddenly complete, a tapestry woven with threads of sorrow and miraculous connection. The air was thick with unsaid words, with the weight of 50 years of separation and silence. But there was also an undeniable current of profound, enduring love, a fragile but powerful bond, instantly forged. Laura was no longer just Laura Ashton, the adopted child. She was also Jennifer, the daughter of Ethan and Margaret, a link in a complex, tumultuous, but ultimately resilient chain of life. The reckoning was not just with her parents, but with her own identity, a journey of pain and profound, unexpected discovery. The past, long buried, had finally come to light, bringing with it the possibility of a future rooted in truth and acceptance. Chapter 8: Threads Reclaimed. The days and weeks that followed the reunion on the quiet farm in upstate New York were a profound, intense immersion into a history Laura had never known. The reckoning was not a singular event, but an ongoing process of sharing, understanding, and healing that unfolded with each sunrise and sunset. Laura, now comfortable being called Jennifer by her biological parents, spent hours listening to their story, the full, harrowing truth of their lives on the run, a narrative far more complex and dangerous than any fiction. Ethan and Margaret, living as Arthur and Mary Smith, had built a quiet, unassuming life, always looking over their shoulders, always wary of strangers, always vigilant for any sign that their past might catch up to them. Their fiery activism of the 70s had mellowed into a deep commitment to sustainable living and environmental causes, their youthful radicalism replaced by a gentle, enduring idealism that found expression in the organic rhythms of the farm. They had lived with the constant ache of their daughter's absence, a silent, festering wound they never thought would heal. Finding Jennifer, seeing her as the successful, loving, compassionate woman she had become, was their life's greatest miracle, a redemption they had never dared to hope for. Laura, in turn, shared details of her life as Laura Ashton, her loving adoptive parents, her fulfilling career as an architect, her steadfast husband, her wonderful children. She showed them countless photos, creating a visual narrative of a life they had tragically missed. They wept over pictures of her son, James, their grandson, whose short life and name resonated so deeply with their own lost infant son, or nephew, close friend's son, depending on the earlier decision, completing a circle of poignant connections. The story of her son's name, chosen unknowingly, but with such powerful resonance, struck them with a profound sense of destiny. The threads of her two lives began to intertwine seamlessly, forming a richer, more complex tapestry. Laura Ashton, the respected architect, the beloved wife and mother, was now also Jennifer, the daughter of Ethan and Margaret, a woman whose story stretched back to the turbulent 1970s and a desperate, life-altering act of survival. She felt a profound sense of completeness, as if a missing piece of her soul had finally snapped into place. She brought her husband and children to meet Ethan and Margaret, a cautious, tender introduction that blossomed into genuine warmth. Her children, initially bewildered by this sudden, dramatic expansion of their family tree, quickly embraced their new grandparents, touched by their extraordinary story and their quiet, loving presence. Laura's husband, always her steadfast support and unshakable anchor, witnessed the profound healing his wife was undergoing and welcomed her biological parents with open arms, recognizing the deep need for connection. Laura also returned to Maine, to her adoptive parents. She brought photos of Ethan and Margaret, shared their incredible story, explaining the extraordinary circumstances that led to her adoption, not as a replacement, but as a lifeline of hope and love. Her adoptive parents, though initially heartbroken that their protective secret was finally out, were ultimately relieved. They had carried the burden of the lie for so long, a silent weight that had dimmed their later years. Seeing Laura happy, seeing her complete, seeing her with her biological family, brought them a peace they hadn't known was possible. The two sets of parents, once separated by a tragic secret and a profound act of love, now shared a complex, expansive love for Laura, their shared daughter. There was no competition, only acceptance and mutual respect for the roles each had played in her life. The unspoken truth that Edith Cutter had initiated with her dying whisper had brought not just shattering revelations, but profound reconciliation and an unexpected expansion of love. Laura learned that identity was not just a name or a birth certificate, but a living, breathing tapestry woven from all the lives that touched hers, all the choices, all the love, all the grief, all the acts of courage and sacrifice. She was Laura Ashton, the cherished product of her adoptive parents, boundless love and unwavering commitment, and she was Jennifer, the daughter of two idealistic, courageous individuals who had made an impossible choice out of desperate, protective love. Both identities were equally true, equally vital to who she had become. She found a deeper understanding of the fire that had haunted her dreams for so long. It was not a memory of personal injury, but of a pivotal, traumatic moment of rupture. A forced separation that had shaped her entire existence. The smoke, the flames, the muffled child's cry, all were part of the story of Jennifer, a little girl left behind, only to be found and given a new name, a new life, a new chance. It was a memory of her parents' sacrifice, a symbol of their desperate act of love. Laura continued her work as an architect, now with a renewed sense of purpose, her designs reflecting a deeper appreciation for history, resilience, and the intricate interconnectedness of lives. She became an advocate for adopted children and adults seeking their biological families, sharing her story as a testament to the fact that truth, however complex or painful, can ultimately bring profound healing and connection. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, and dedicated a portion of her time to helping others navigate their own journeys of discovery. The quiet whisper of Edith Cutter on her deathbed had not been a curse, but a profound blessing, a final act of unexpected wisdom that unraveled a lifetime of secrets. It had led Laura on an extraordinary journey, a journey that reclaimed not just her past, but her entire, multifaceted self. The threads of her life, once tangled and fractured, were now woven into a rich, complete tapestry, strong and beautiful, finally whole, imbued with a deep understanding that love, in all its forms, is the most powerful force of all. The story of Laura Ashton, or rather, Jennifer, was a testament to the enduring power of truth, the resilience of the human spirit, and the boundless capacity of the heart to heal and embrace its own complex, beautiful narrative.